Welcome to China Tech Talk, a weekly discussion of technology and startups here in China. I'm John Artman, editor-in-chief of TechNode, and as always, I'm joined by Matthew Brennan, founder of China Channel. On October 8th, regulations that hold group chat managers accountable for member behavior came into effect here in China. Now, people who create and manage groups on WeChat, QQ, or Baidu Tieba are legally responsible for what is said in their group chats. On top of that, the platforms now must create social credit systems that will reflect user behavior and could impact their social credit score given by the government. So here's a quick list of the topics that should now be avoided in group chats. So sensitive political content, rumors, internal documents of the Chinese Communist Party and government units, content that is vulgar, pornographic, violent, or shows drug-related criminal acts, news from Hong Kong and Macau that has not been reported by official media outlets, military information, state secrets, videos from anonymous sources that insult or destroy the Chinese police's reputation, or other illegal information. So as you can see, this is a fairly exhaustive list and quite ambiguous at the same time. The problem is, of course, is that many of these platforms have not actually fully implemented a way to really manage the group chats. So this week we're talking a little bit about group chats, but then also just kind of looking at other issues around censorship, around how the Communist Party and the Chinese government control information here in China. Matt and I, we were talking about this, and it's almost one of those topics where we should have talked about it earlier, but now with the implementation of this new rule, the 19th Party Congress coming up next as of this recording next week, we thought this would be a great time to really kind of dive in and give you guys a better understanding of what's actually happening here.
Yeah, it's very topical, and we're both extremely well placed to talk about this. Myself and John are foreigners. We're not Chinese. I'm from London. John, what city are you from? Actually, I'm not even sure.
I was born in Texas. Let's. It's a long story, but okay. We'll just say I was born in Texas.
Born in Texas. I would have never put you down as Texas. Okay, I'm learning here. So yeah, we're both non-Chinese, but have been resident in China for a considerable time and intend to keep residing in China. And we're both deeply involved in the sort of tech area and the media area in China. So there's actually we're pretty well placed to talk about this, and a lot the world. There has been a lot of ink spilt about this area, and also recently about the new regulations with VPNs, especially when the App Store took down all the VPN apps. That made big global headlines recently, and so we're very much at the forefront of this and have to deal with this on a daily basis. So I think we both realized, okay, we should probably take one episode and just cover this as best we can, and hopefully give our perspective, having to deal with this on a day-to-day basis here in China. Perhaps we can provide some insight to our listeners.
Yeah, exactly, and it's interesting because looking at the group chats themselves, I think this is one of those areas that I have a very wait and see attitude. When it comes to a lot of edicts and new regulations, strict or light, that come from the government. I'm actually writing a piece for the TechNode website right now. It's supposed to be about Bitcoin and blockchain, but it's actually the middle of it actually turned into a bit of a discussion of how to guess what the Chinese government is going to do or how they're going to react to certain things. And, you look at this idea of managing group chats and being responsible. And while it did come into effect on October 8th, so just this week, on the one hand, the platforms themselves have not actually given group managers the tools to really actually effectively manage the chats themselves. It's very much at this point ad hoc enforcement, and the platforms themselves just are not capable of providing support to the group managers. So I have to wonder just how serious the government actually is about enforcing this. It's similar to, when they mandated that Sina Weibo have all of their users as registered with their ID, with their Chinese ID. And so when that came into effect, Sina Weibo, they made noises about how they were actually going to implement it. But then if you tested it, you saw very quickly that they weren't actually enforcing that very well. Fast forward to now, and you try to register a new Sina Weibo account, and you have to provide a Chinese ID number or a passport number. So obviously, over time, that actually they created this enforceable mechanism. But when the government first mandated it, they weren't actually doing that great of a job. And so with these group chat rules, my sense is that part of it is what the government is trying to create a chilling effect, so that people will stop talking about the things that I just listed. And it's not necessarily going to be a systematically enforced policy across all of Chinese social media.
Yeah, I agree. Often these rules come out and they don't get enforced, right? Or they're unenforceable, and there's many examples of that. There is this new very large meeting of the governments. The what's the official title? The 19th.
It's the 19th Party Congress. So this
19th Party Congress, yeah, which is coming up very, very soon. Right? And I think that's every time this huge event comes up, because it's a very politically important event. There's a lot of clampdown online, and the government departments get very, very nervous, and nobody wants anything to go wrong or any sort of bad news stories to come out during that time. And so that's why we see this tightening of regulations during this period, and usually they get relaxed afterwards. But what we've seen this time round is that the regulations have been tightened in terms of the internet space much more than previously. And given the political situation with Xi Jinping, who's obviously a very, very powerful leader, he seems to be much more powerful than his predecessor and the last couple of leaders, that people are speculating that this might just end up being the normal situation.
So, Matt, I think you made a really good point just now about the difference between Xi Jinping and Hu Jintao. And I think that a lot of the predictions that I have made and other pundits have made about what China may or may not do, how well or how systematically they may or may not enforce certain regulations, a lot of that is based on past behavior from when Hu Jintao was the president and the general secretary of the Communist Party. So I think it bears mentioning that Hu Jintao in general has been seen as a fairly weak leader of the country. So the way that it works is that the president serves 2 terms, 2 5-year terms. And so the Congress that's coming up now is the 19th Party Congress, and it's going to mark the beginning of Xi Jinping's second term. So he's already been in office. He's already been in power for 5 years. Now, when Hu Jintao was in office, there was actually quite a bit of corruption, and the government was not very active, if you will. They made a lot of noise, but at the end of the day, they did not they were not too strict. Hu Jintao, as a leader, seems to have been, as I mentioned, fairly weak. Now, Xi Jinping comes in, and as soon as he comes in, he starts with this huge anti-corruption campaign, and many people were just really surprised by how long it's lasted. I mean, it basically hasn't ended. When Hu Jintao came into power, he did something similar, but it ended within his first term, and then towards the end of the second term, corruption became a really big problem. But what we've seen with Xi Jinping is that it basically has not ended. Party discipline has gotten stricter. The Chinese government has gotten much, much stricter. And so you look at what's happening now with VPNs, with group chats, with more regulation of online entertainment and things like that, where in the past maybe you can say, okay, well, we kind of saw this coming. On the other hand, it wasn't until Xi Jinping comes into power that someone is there to really push this forward and make it, these types of control mechanisms a reality.
Yeah. I think the government in China has been quite consistent, though, in the sort of what they're trying to achieve with the internet has been quite clear to me, at least. And I think they're just realizing that they want control over the Chinese internet. They feel that's their right. The internet is an extension of the sort of physical world. That within the borders of China, that they should have the right to control anything on the internet. That they feel that is their right as the government to be able to do that. And this actually goes against the principles and the philosophy of the internet, right? So the internet was founded basically in the States and pushed forward in Silicon Valley based on values of openness, based on values of open information, of net neutrality, of freedom of information, and with no one controlling the system. And actually, we kind of take that as given in most of the world that the internet should be like that, but should it? It's kind of fortuitous that the internet and this technology grew up in that kind of environment and was driven by people who had those ideals. And now as the internet is maturing across the world, I think we're seeing places like China, places like Russia, where different ideas are popping out about how the internet should be, which are quite different in that it should be controlled, that it should have some centralized authority, and some control and some rules and regulations, which are either which here in China are put forward by the government, and people can't do what they want. You can't say what you want to say, or you can't do what you want to do, and this is something that is fundamentally at odds with how most people very, very passionately feel about what the internet should be. So I think what China's been able to achieve, for example, with the Great Firewall, is on a technical level very, very impressive. I think a lot of people felt that it was impossible to do what they're actually doing now with turning the Chinese internet almost into an intranet. But this is very much aligned with what everything they've said in terms of, and then what everything they've done in terms of they just want control over the Chinese internet, and so when we talk about areas like VPN, for example, and how they took down all the VPNs from the App Store recently, and how using VPNs in China is getting increasingly difficult. Just before we started recording this podcast, I was complaining to John about how my VPN stopped working, and certainly recently there's been a lot of VPNs getting trouble, and their servers being blocked. And there's people speculating that in the future it might just become almost impossible to use a VPN in China if you're not using a special government sanctioned VPN, which are available for companies. And I actually think that there's some degree of truth in that. I think that probably is quite close to what the goal of the government wants to achieve here, in that they recognize that there is a legitimate need for businesses to access the wider internet, but in terms of the normal citizen, prefer it that it was quite difficult for them to access information that they don't want them to see, and that's what they want to achieve in the long run. So everything that they're doing here is moving towards that reality where I'm not talking about technical people, because on a technical level, as far as I understand, I'm not a deep technical person, to be honest, but from speaking to people who are, that it is actually impossible for them to achieve that on a technical level. All they want to do is make it so that for normal people, for your average Joe, it's extremely difficult, or just beyond the not worth bothering with.
Exactly.
It's just too much trouble for you to go and try and access information that the government believes that you shouldn't be able to access.
Exactly. And it's actually interesting too, because what happens, they've blocked a lot of different sites and a lot of different sources of traffic. And the problem is that if you're here in China and you want to go to a site that's not blocked, so for example, our website, technode.com. Well, technode.com it is connected to Google Analytics. It does have Twitter buttons and LinkedIn buttons and Facebook buttons that allow people to share our content easily. On our front page, we have a MailChimp sign up box where people can sign up for our newsletters. So the thing is, even though our website is not on the Great Firewall blacklist, the bits and the pieces of our website are. And so that, in fact, can actually severely increase the loading time for people who are trying to access our content while they're in China. And so it's interesting. So they don't even need to block every single site to do what you were just saying, Matt, to create that, to increase the amount of friction for people to visit certain sites that is not within the, as you called it, I think correctly, the Chinese intranet. And to go back to your point, I don't think if the internet was created in a place like China, we would never have actually seen it be adopted in the rest of the world. The Chinese government, number one, what they want is control. They want to control what's happening inside their country. They want to control, to a certain degree, what their citizens think, what they talk about. And the internet is almost completely at odds to this idea of control. I think that we are seeing that it's not 100% true anymore, that you can still have the internet, but not have it be 100% open, as we see here in China. And I think that, honestly, it's almost I'm not making any value judgments. I'm not saying that it's right or that it's wrong, but I do think that given political currents and political trends, it is natural, in a sense, for governments all around the world to be asking themselves these questions. In the States, in the EU, the governments don't do it, or they take a fairly light touch when it comes to regulating or controlling information on the internet, because values in those countries say that openness is a good thing, that people should have access to information. A lot of this is coming from the Enlightenment of the 16th and 17th centuries, where scientists, intellectuals, they came up with what is now actually a very pervasive framework of thought that pervades Western society to such a high degree that most people who are born and raised there, they have no idea that how much scientists and theoreticians, how much impact they actually had on our political systems and on our beliefs in political ideas. But you go to Russia, you come to China, and those ideas just are not. They don't really exist. The idea of a liberal, open society where people are able to freely transact in an open market, these ideas don't exist here. Whether or not they could I think is a very different and very interesting question. But it's not like even these ideas. They almost took root in China in the early 1900s. But then they didn't. And this podcast is not the place to talk about that. But I think that basically what we are seeing is that, the number one, the Chinese government, the Russian government, they want control. And then number two, the Chinese government, they are very practical. So they as you say, they recognize that there is value to the internet. I mean, if any country, take North Korea, for example, if they decided to completely cut themselves off, well, they turn into a pauper very, very quickly. And Xi Jinping and China, they're very ambitious. They do want to lead the world. They do want to, they want to rejuvenate the Chinese people and fulfill the Chinese dream. And part of that is going to be, becoming an economic powerhouse, and you have to have the internet to do that. So in that sense, they're very practical, but in another sense, they're going to do as much as they can to make sure that they can maintain as much control as possible. And that's exactly what we're seeing. And so when it comes to VPN technology in particular, it's really just it's a cat and mouse game, where ultimately it is going to be impossible to block 100% of traffic that you don't want. But at the same time, they're going to figure out ways of compromising. They're going to figure out ways of making, as you were saying, increase the friction. They're going to find ways to make it as difficult as possible for people to access information that they don't want them to. And so everyone, when the VPN ban came into effect, I think everyone was surprised. I was quite surprised. Number one, that they would require it. Number two, that Apple would actually follow through with it. But at the same time, looking at this framework of practical control, it makes sense.
It didn't surprise me that much, to be honest. And that Apple would go along with it as well made sense. I think Apple have changed their strategy in China this year quite a lot, and they've realized that their position is quite weak, and they've actually made a lot of changes. They've opened up they're opening up research and development centers. It seems they're playing ball with the Chinese government. They're playing ball with Tencent and the other big players a lot more now, and that's really good for them, because that's pretty much their only chance of in the long term staying in the country and keeping. They've been very successful, but there's been warning signs, right? And I think we've talked about that on previous episodes. That also leads. I think this area is connected to another really hot topic, which is if China didn't have this big firewall, if they didn't have this idea of controlling the internet and keeping out foreign, especially social networks like Facebook, would China have these big internet giants? Would Tencent and Alibaba and all the other big players, would Baidu be where it is today if Google was allowed in China? That's one of the classic questions that it comes up, and people love to talk about that. My personal take on that is that it was a pretty smart move from the government to block the big giants from the States. And when you look on other big global markets around the world, India would be a good example, right? So India has huge potential. It's the same as China. They've got a massive market, and they haven't blocked Facebook or Google, but this because of. So you look at the difference there, just a very simple comparison. Because China did protect their own environment and allow their local companies to grow to a certain size where they're able to compete. Because the America's had a head start on the internet essentially, and the internet is a winner takes all environment for the big players. Once you get to a certain scale and a certain size, people just can't compete with you. Nobody can compete with Google for search. It's impossible, because they have so many advantages accrued up. So the only way to build companies that can compete with Apple, Google, Facebook is to do what China did. If they hadn't have blocked off the internet, Baidu would have been killed by Google. Tencent would have been killed by Facebook. Is that the case now? If they opened up the internet now and suddenly say, okay, we're dropping this firewall and Facebook can come in and do what they want to do and Google can come in and do what they want to do, I think they'd be fine. I think Baidu would be able to compete. Tencent would be able to compete. And but if they'd done it, years and years back, those companies would have been crushed. So when you look at it from that point, from a strategy of China feels that we should have internet companies that are on the same level as the states, then what they did with blocking those guys is pretty much they had no choice in my mind if they really wanted to allow their local companies to flourish and for them to be able to really compete with those guys, given how the economics works on the internet.
I agree to a certain degree. I think that when you look at Facebook and Twitter, they were initially blocked for political reasons. This was around the time of the color revolutions, and Twitter, both Twitter and Facebook were being used as ways to organize, as ways to publicize these quote unquote revolutions that were happening in the Middle East. And so the government said, okay, you know what, we cannot control this, so we're just going to completely shut it off. So from the way I see it, the initial blockage was political because there was information that could threaten the stability of the country. But they kept the blocks in place, as you were saying, for economic reasons. And I think that that's one of the big reasons that both Facebook and Twitter have remained blocked. Now, when it comes to search, when it comes to Google, actually Google, when they decided to completely exit China, their market share of the search market was actually quite low. Baidu still had more than a majority of that market share. Whether or not, if Google had stayed, whether or not they would have been able to really kind of double down and increase their presence and improve their product is, I think, an interesting question to ask. But at the time when they left, Google's Chinese search was inferior to Baidu's. And Google's Chinese search right now, in my opinion, is inferior to Baidu's Chinese search. And I think that a lot of users, unless they're international, unless they're searching in English, more than likely they would use Baidu anyway. So I think that when you look at search, I'm not so sure if Google could have or would have been a threat. When it comes to something like e-commerce, I think e-commerce would have been is actually something where Amazon is active in China. I think that the government has probably put a bit more pressure on them than they would a domestic company. But at the same time, when Amazon came into China, they've really kind of had to figure out this market, and it's taken them a long time, long enough that they're still a very minor player in the country. So I mean, I think you're making an interesting point about the economics, and I think it's true for some, but it's not true necessarily across the board for China's giants.
Yeah, good pushback. I would say wasn't Google. I honestly, it's a genuine question because I can't remember, but I got the feeling that Google was kind of partially being blocked, weren't they? They were like very slow, or I remember using Google when it was available in China, and it was like, they do this thing where it's not blocked, but they make it almost unusable in terms of it's just very slow, or it's just intermittent service. And things like that. I get the feeling they were being messed around simply because their servers were not in China, right? There was a lot of that stuff going on, if I remember correctly. Yeah,
that's true. And also, I'm looking at some numbers now, and Google, when they were at 15% of the market in 2006, and by 2010, they when they quit China, when they left the country, they were at 31%, which is not a small figure. So it does seem that they were on that path to rival Baidu at the very least. So
I guess regardless of the actual, I think it's a theoretical decision and just putting forward what is in some people's mind, maybe it's a bit controversial, but I think, from a government's perspective, I'm putting forward a reason of why they would do this, regardless of whether the details. But it makes sense that the internet is winner takes all.
Yeah.
How can you possibly compete with these big companies that already have 5-10 years head start on the local companies? The only way we have a big enough market where we can build companies that will be able to compete with them. But if we allow them to compete now, they won't be able to do it.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. As a theoretical framework, I completely agree. And you can see something similar in other parts of the economy, where if you're a foreign multinational trying to come in and do business, I mean, the audio industry is a great example. Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes, Ford, all these companies, if they want to do business in China, if they want to sell to China, they have to create a joint venture with a local company, and through that joint venture, produce inside China these cars for the domestic market, and so it's very, very similar and really smart if you think about it, because multinational companies they can be a bit colonial in the sense that they're going to come into a developing market, and they are, because of their global reach, because of as you were saying, the time advantage that they've had, the size, they're able to go into developing markets and completely dominate. And of course, because they're multinational corporations headquartered in a different country, they're not necessarily beholden to the politics or to the politicians in any given country, and so they can come in and wreak havoc in many ways to a domestic economy and really stifle domestic companies from ever actually becoming successful on that same scale. And so I think China, the government was super smart. They said, we're not going to allow that to happen. There are some very strategic areas that we need to make sure that China can actually do well, can compete globally. And, automobiles is one, and the internet is another. I'm sure there's more that I can't think of now, but you look at it and it's very, very clear that what you were saying makes sense. They want to make sure that China has globally competitive companies, and if they were to allow a Google or a Facebook or a Twitter to come in unfettered, then as you say, that probably would not be possible.
Especially with social networks, there's just such a strong winner takes all network effect that goes into that. And yeah, I read the book, The House That Jack Ma Built, I think, by Ian Duncan. It's a good book.
Duncan Clark, yeah.
Sorry, Duncan Clark.
Yeah, we're gonna get him on the podcast at some point.
Yep, it's a great book. Recommended that to our listeners. And it talks about this from Alibaba from a historical perspective. So when people talk about Alibaba, from a historical perspective, the big thing is always how they beat eBay. They were the sort of David and Goliath battle, fighting this big American giant. And it's quite interesting how when you go through the book there, eBay just messed up so badly in China. It was ridiculous. They shot themselves in the foot. I don't think it was. I mean, obviously, Jack Ma and his team did a great job, but they were helped by the fact that the eBay was just so poor in China. They made just so many schoolboy errors across the board. Now, one of them was that they shifted, even way back then, they shifted their servers locally from China over to the States.
Interesting.
And at that point, when they started doing that, immediately their service became super slow and almost unusable for many users. So you can see that even back there, Alibaba makes a big deal about how they fought off this giant from the States, and it's a big part of their company culture. But even that, it wasn't really a fair fight in some ways. Alibaba, eBay by doing what they by centralizing it and bringing back their service to the States, they then hit upon this big problem for their users. But the thing is, there was such a disconnect between the local team in China and the team in the States that they didn't even realize it was a problem for a long time. That nobody could really use that their service was super slow, almost unusable in China. Which just goes to show how bad the management had become. Yeah,
and also I think it's a credit to foreign internet companies that are now operating in China. I mean, as you said, Apple, they're pivoting their China strategy. Airbnb is another good example. They take the China market very, very seriously. They just recently appointed a new China head, and they're taking it slow. I think a great example of a company not doing well is a company like Groupon when they first came in. Is one of those classic examples of trying to treat the market like it was back at home. But so it's interesting. It's really kind of gratifying in a sense to see that Silicon Valley companies are learning from previous mistakes, in the sense that it's not, I mean, as you were saying, it's about understanding what's actually happening here, both in terms of the users and the market, but then also when it comes to regulations, and how really to navigate the politics of this country. But I feel like we've deviated quite severely.
We have.
But I mean, I mean, for me at least, I can talk about the Chinese government and politics all day. I used to when I was doing the radio, we used to talk about this stuff a lot. So it's something that's definitely kind of in my wheelhouse. But coming back to the group chats, I think this really, I mean, the big question now, as I think we mentioned in the beginning, is this actually enforceable, and are platforms going to implement this, and what is that going to look like? I mean, like at this point, Tencent doesn't even have a social credit system in place. They're developing it, they're testing it, but the only company right now that really has a social credit system is not even a social network, which is Alipay.
So the group thing, the group thing, I think is unenforceable right now, quite clearly, and I'm sure the government knows that. They're just putting that out there as you're responsible. If you manage a group, you're responsible for what happens in that group, as a way that they can, point to that regulation if they need to, in order to make someone responsible for what's going on. I don't think they realistically expect it to be enforced straight away. In the mid-long term, it could definitely be enforced, and I think it makes sense because when you look at how things work in China from a business perspective, or even let's take from a business perspective, there's always someone that has to be responsible. If you open a business in China, there's what they call a FRN, right? A legal rep, and that's the person that's legally responsible for the business. If anything happens, if they are the person who will get into trouble. And these kind of systems are all the way through on working in China, is that there's always an ID card or a person that's tied to what's happening and is responsible for what's happening. And that should be one person. Once you get into an area where there's it's fuzzy and there's multiple people who could be blamed or could be responsible for this area, that's not actually how Chinese like to work, and it's not how the processes and the systems work here. It's usually that one person is responsible, and it's very clear. So it makes a lot of sense, actually, what the government is trying to do here, to me, anyway.
And it's interesting as well. I say interesting way too often, but it is interesting to see. If you project forward 2, 3, 4, 5 years, it's really interesting to see how the direction that this is all going in, and it's going in a direction that is centralizing the internet, centralizing internet activity, so that the government can monitor and police it even more effectively, potentially, than offline. And this is to me what's so fascinating about what's happening right now with technology and with what the government is doing with the technology is, I think we've talked a little bit about this before in the facial recognition episode, but the government is very keen to see their enforcement problems solved. And, while on the one hand, with the internet, it does allow for discussions and topics that they don't like, which is why they have these group rules. On the other hand, it does actually allow them, potentially, to see everything that actually happens. And since every Chinese citizen has a government issued ID number, and and soon, I think they've rolled it out across the country. Foreigners who have work permits also are given an ID number. It's a unique ID number that it only counts. It's only assigned to one specific person. So what happens is that every single thing that you do that's connected to this ID number is potentially visible to the government. And of course, we ran a story recently about WeChat's privacy rules, and as you might imagine, we got quite a bit of pushback from the company and their PR in terms of clarifying. But at the end of the day, I mean, if you look at these companies, any information, it doesn't even have to be a Chinese company, any information that's stored in China, as it would be in the United States, is legally accessible by the government. Whereas in the U.S., you need a subpoena, you need to have a judge approve it, you need to, there are these hurdles and these obstacles intentionally put in place to protect the people from their government, because that's, in the U.S., that's part of our value system. In China, that's not necessary. There really aren't those legal processes or hurdles for any enforcement body to go in and say, hey, we need to look at this. And, for a company to not acquiesce to something like that is very difficult for me to imagine. So you think about IDs everywhere, facial recognition everywhere, and pretty soon blockchain everywhere. And like I said, I'm working on a piece right now about Bitcoin and blockchain, but the main thrust of it is that blockchain solves so many problems for the government in terms of monitoring and enforcement, so that if you can have an indelible record of all transactions, you can see exactly what people are spending money on, what they're doing with their lives, and you can say, oh, okay, well, the economy or society is moving in a certain direction. Let's start doing some things over here to make sure that it goes in the direction that we want it to go in, which is kind of what they're already doing. Although it's very crude in a sense, very crude to foreigners, a bit heavy-handed and a bit too obvious sometimes. I'm not sure if that's true from the point of view of a born and bred Chinese citizen, but what they're doing now in a crude fashion, very, very soon, I mean, within the next 5 years, I think, they will be able to do that in a very subtle, almost invisible way, just by controlling and just by controlling inputs and controlling what people are allowed to do. And so you think about the possibility, and again, I'm not making any value judgments here. I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong. That's a debate for some other time. But I'm just trying to call it as it is. The Chinese government is going to be able to create an online environment that is better regulated, more visible, more monitorable, and more enforceable than the offline world, I think.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah. It's fantastic, this technology, in terms of being able to track everything. Every activity, not every activity. I mean, if you go to the toilet and have a piss, I don't think there's a digital footprint for that. But there may be.
Exactly. Scan a QR code or use NFC or something like that, right?
Right. I mean, with mobile payments, everything you buy through there is trackable. the online and offline worlds are merging as we go into sort of AR, VR, mixed reality in the future. That's just going to be even more so. And that makes everything trackable. So what's really interesting is what you touched upon there is the economic aspect. So if the economy becomes fully digitalized in terms of monetary transactions, and the government can actually track everything that's going on and see clearly, and has ways to control it, then what becomes possible in terms of economic regulation is very, very different from what we have now, where things are, like you say, you're using crude tools to control the economy. What happens if you have perfect information about what's happening with economic transactions? That's never been possible, but it might be quite soon, right? In China, at least. And I don't think this is asking very, very deep questions about about economics and what how things should be, and we're moving into uncharted territory.
Yeah, but to me, I completely agree. It is uncharted territory. But to me, it feels like a very mature version of capitalism, or I guess that's probably not the correct way to think about it. But it is a mature version of the current market system that we see around the world. And again, I think that it all comes down to values. The U.S. government and our values there are so different from here that it's almost inconceivable for the government to be able to use unfettered, perfect information for their own political purposes. In China, that's something that maybe people don't think it's okay, but they don't talk about it very often. That's for sure.
I'm not so concerned about the political aspect here. I'm thinking more just in terms of economic management, sort of being politically neutral, right? And just thinking about, the government has to make economic decisions. They have to. There's depressions. There's boom and bust economy, and nobody likes it. It's horrible, right? And if there was a way to solve that, that would be really, really great for the economy and for people in general, to have a more sort of, when you look back at the great crash, back in, was it 2008, right? So there was an economic crisis across the world it was looking like the whole economic system might collapse. What happens if in the future, through technology, we can stop things like that from ever being a possibility? I have no idea if that's possible, right? But certainly, if you can track everything, and if it's possible to see what's going on down to a very, very micro level of the economy, and have controls and levers over that, then that could be used in a very, very good way.
Yeah, it could. I'm actually reading a book by Ian Banks right now, against a dark background, and in the book there's this part of the book. There's this one culture that for hundreds of years they've had no progress whatsoever. And the way they deal with that is any extra money that is generated in their economy, their king goes to a different society where there is progress and buys whatever costs that amount of money, and then never actually uses it. And so I think it's a really interesting example of, I think, what I was thinking about when you were saying that is that there is this potential for, this like a society and an economy that has very little or very much slower progress, and because of that, everything is much more stable. And I think it's an interesting idea to play around with, because the Chinese government, they talk a lot about stability. So they talk a lot about maintaining social order. They talk about maintaining economic order and things like, and economic stability. And so, I think you're going into an area that I find super interesting, because, as you say, if they are able to create with technology like a perfect order, they're going to try to do that. And again, I think whether or not that's a good thing is a very, very big question that we're not necessarily equipped to talk about here. But the potential is staggering, I think. I mean, because you look at all these types of technology, we are going in a certain direction. And I think that direction is becoming a bit more mature. We're in China, a lot of the Chinese story right now is bringing in more consumption, giving people more disposable income, giving people a safety net so that they can spend that money. And once China fully becomes a consumption-driven economy, I mean, being able to keep everything even, that's going to be so powerful. And it's one of those things. This is why I love what we do when we're talking about technology and we're talking about what we're going on, because thinking about the future and thinking about what is possible, I think it's absolutely fascinating.
The government in China is very supportive of technology. I think they're very supportive of AI, and they want China to be leading the world, and they want to be harnessing this technology in order to, yes, better govern China, but also, I think they actually are pretty smart, right? A lot of people, they get, there's a characterization that the government is in China is doesn't know how to run the economy, that they're sort of that these guys who are at the top are super smart guys, I think, and they've actually done, in my opinion, a pretty good job of managing the Chinese economy. There's constantly China bears out there saying that the economy is going to crash, the whole thing's built upon unsustainable trends, and the economy's never crashed. Like it's never happened since the 80s when China opened up with Deng Xiaoping era up until now. Things have broadly been growing. They've been growing quite fast, actually, for a lot of that time. But the economy's never crashed, and it's been managed. It's not been managed perfectly. Don't get me wrong. There's many things that are bad, but I would say they've done overall a pretty impressive job of economic management, and they're looking forward into the future and seeing the writings on the wall with technology going to be leading stuff, and they're embracing this. The Chinese government's embracing technology and saying we need to lead this, we need to be on top of this. And again, I think it's a smart move. I think it's a super smart move, and other governments around the world should also be doing the same thing.
Yeah, I mean it's I think if you talk to an economist, they'll probably have a lot of complaints about what China is doing and how they create certain market conditions artificially. They pick winners. I'm not qualified to comment on whether it's true, but whether or not they manipulate their currency, keep it artificially low. So I think that there are, again, there are some very big value questions that need to be asked here. But on the other hand, I have to agree with you, Matt, that they have done a really good job. And the thing is, they're really smart about how they do it as well. So I think, the Chinese ascension to the WTO is actually a really interesting example where the central government, one of the reasons that they wanted to join the WTO is to force domestic reform that might not otherwise have been possible. Because you got to remember that, while Xi Jinping is the president of the country, he is the general secretary of the Communist Party, it's not a good example for Xi Jinping. He's gathered a lot of power to himself. But you look at Hu Jintao, for example, you look at Jiang Zemin, they were ruling by consensus. and to a certain degree, China still is ruled by consensus. And so you have a fairly small group of people at the very, very top making these very broad decisions about these broad policy decisions. But the thing is, a lot of it is trickled down to smaller central ministries, but then also to the provinces, to municipal bureaus and other parts of the bureaucracy. And so they're super smart about how they implement certain policies, and they allow it to kind of, again, trickle down, and they create the conditions, the general atmosphere where the Joe Schmo, who is a clerk at some random bureau in the let's just say the bureau, the postal bureau in Chengdu, he's going to be thinking about this when he's deciding, when he's making a decision about his work and how he does it. And so that, I think, is super interesting, because they're able to be very subtle about how certain policies that they cannot control directly, how they're still going in the direction that they want it to go in. It's as you say, I mean, I have a certain admiration for the Chinese government because of that. Well, Matt, I think that's about all the time that we have for this episode. I think I think this is actually one of my favorite episodes that we've done together so far. I always enjoy talking about kind of what's happening in a broader sense of with the government and regulations and policy, and then as it dovetails into technology, and then of course our daily lives. I think it was we talked about a lot of different things, but I think it was a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, we definitely meandered around.
Yeah.
But yeah, and recently, so when you finish listening to this podcast, hopefully, if you did enjoy it, maybe you could leave a review for us on where do you leave reviews on
iTunes?
iTunes.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not an Apple user. That really showed there. I've always used Android. But yeah, we got some reviews recently from a couple of listeners in the States, and that was really cool. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. Reviews are actually super important for podcasts. The way that iTunes and other podcasting apps surface recommendations is by these reviews, actually. And so it's actually really helpful for us if our listeners, if you guys do take the time to leave us a review on iTunes. If you're on iOS and you have Overcast, you can just tap the star button, or if you're on Pocket Cast, you can tap that star button as well. But basically, it's a way for these platforms to surface interesting content for other people. And so the more reviews it gets, the more positive reviews a product or a podcast gets, the more likely it is that this will surface to other listeners. And so it's one of those things where by leaving a review, you're not just saying how much you like us, and maybe you have something to complain about, which is fine. But it's also a way to let other people know about this, about what we're doing, about the conversations that we have here and the interviews that we do. And so if you liked it, if you like this show, if you like this episode, show everyone else that you do, and help us spread the word, because that's really how we're going to grow the podcast and grow this community. And at the end of the day, it's we wouldn't be here without our listeners, and we're always very thankful for everyone who does take the time to listen.